Right, right bank. Um, it's exciting right now to be talking about the right bank of Bordeaux, given that, as you'll know, in the when we've introduced these tastings or the previous tasting, we've really been exploring key expressions from great producers from a range of great vintages, but in the context of the 2020 vintage, which we are, I won't even say in the middle of, we're at the beginning of, and it's been a pretty good start. In fact, it's been a great start. But one of the things which is definitely coming out more and more clearly is how successful 2020 is for Merlot, for the right bank, and for clay over limestone soils. Now, that's not to say that you can just say, oh, it's a right bank vintage, it's a Merlot vintage, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, probably one of the most interesting articles on the vintage was published by the drinks business Bordeaux writer Colin Hay on Monday, and I will send a link. I'll probably just post a link in the chat because everyone should read that piece. It's a really, it's not long, but it's a brilliant, incredibly enthusiastic, I should say, piece about the 2020 vintage. But pivotally, it really drills down into the nuances of why it's so successful. Not just, it's not a homogeneous vintage 2020, but the peaks are absolutely exceptional. And where you have this alignment of clay over limestone soil, Merlot, and we do find an awful lot on the right bank. These are, well, as Colin Hay has said, truly exceptional, highly unique, and utterly spectacular vintage. The most exciting vintage I've ever tasted on Prieuré, and by some margin. That is some pretty powerful expression of praise, coming on the back of 2018 and 2019, which, as we know, are amazing vintages. I think we could safely say, before we plunge into our first wine, and well, if you've plunged into it already, fine, but well, I'm going to say 18, 19, and 20 represent unquestionably the best trilogy of Bordeaux vintages ever. I think, and I'm very happy if anyone wants to suggest or put in the chat another trio of vintages where every single year has, superlative wines, then I'd love to know. I mean, Bordeaux is replete with great duos. We've seen some wonderful back-to-back vintages in the past, but I can't ever remember such enthusiasm for a trio of vintages as 18, 19, and 20. So with that, on that bombshell, let's move to our first wine, Chateau Desier 2018. 2018 was the first of this trio of solar vintages, very hot, very dry years, vintages which frankly, had they been making wine in the same way as they were in, for example, 2003, the wine styles would be quite different, and the wines would frankly not be as good as they are. There was a wonderful quote last night, for those of you who were joining our Bordeaux summit, from Nicolas Audebert, the technical, well, actually the chateau director of Canon, Angelus, Canon, and Berliquet, and also Rosin Segler and Margaux, when talking specifically about the heat and the drought of the 18 vintage, and also to a degree the 19 and certainly the 20, saying that this incredible heat is a good thing, because it allows you the opportunity to make, here we go, James coming in, it allows you to make an even better wine, or it gives you the potential to do so. As he said, with these very hot weather, his comment was, it's better to put the brakes on a fast horse than try to whip a slow donkey. So there you go. That's a great quote as far as I'm concerned. But and if you want to unpack that, what he obviously basically means is, if you don't get enough sunshine, nothing you can do is going to get you ripe fruit and get you a nice balanced wine. If you've got a lot of sun and a lot of heat, modern day winemaking allows you to mitigate that and still get a balanced wine. So hence the 2013 was a donkey. There wasn't much you could do to that vintage to make it win a race. You were never gonna be quids in at the 230 at Chepstow on that one, I'm afraid. But 2018, the first of these three very exciting vintages, and we start with what I would describe as a modest but incredibly successful Saint Emilion. This is Chateau Desier, the biggest mark in the appellation at 40 hectares. That's very significant in size. And I think Jonathan makes 15,000 cases. So 15,000 cases is a lot for the right bank. And just to give you a little bit of context, wineries in the Medoc, the famous chateaus, Lafite, for example, will regularly churn out 20,000 cases plus. Over here on the right bank, particularly in Pomerol, we'll see later, production tends to number in the low single thousands. So, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, that sort of thing, maybe a bit more, but 15,000 cases is big. So Teyssier was Jonathan's first venture in Bordeaux when he set up there in 1994. The vineyards are down. It's actually near Montbusquet. The vineyards are near Montbusquet, if you know Montbusquet, but it's very much down in the plain of Saint Emilion. So Saint Emilion as an appellation is really divided into effectively two regions. You've got the plain, the lower slopes. These are the ones which tend to get walloped, sadly, by frost. So when you get bad frost, if you've got vineyards down on the plain, you're in trouble. And then you have the vineyards, which we'll be exploring a bit later, which are up on the côte or even the plateau. And you have a different soil, different microclimate, a better kind of diurnal temperature difference, day, night, etc. And it's where the sort of the better wines, certainly the most heralded and more expensive wines, tend to come from. But for all that, Chateau Desier is completely on the march. This was a wine which I think just recently was rescored up to 94 points. And it's benchmark quality Jonathan style Saint Emilion. Currently still at 80% Merlot, 20% Cabernet Franc. It's one of the bigger Cabernet Franc expressions from the wines on the plain. And it still sees about 25% new oak. So, Teyssier is Jonathan's workhorse wine, but it's not a donkey. Let's put it that way. It's definitely more on the horse side. It's a really, really good wine. Ever since sort of taking control of the distribution, i.e., removing himself from Le Place, the wines have been very, very well priced. And they do go up on Primeur, simple as that. As soon as they become physical, the price goes up by 20%. So, it's not an investable wine, Chateau Desier, but it's definitely one of those, investing in your future drinking pleasure style of wines, I have to say. Well, I mean, what do you think of it? The 18, I mean, it should be drinking absolutely beautifully right now. Young, but lovely. Any comments, any thoughts? Don't be shy. Come on. Oh gosh, we need to send you full bottles, don't we?
I'll jump in, Tom, because we tasted the 2020 as well from barrel, and I had 2016 just yesterday alongside the conference we had. The 16 was really broad-shouldered and burnished and had a lot of polish to it. The 18 today is tasting quite fleshy, less voluminous than the 16, but still very pleasing, very juicy wine. And the 20, I don't know, Tom, I'm not sure if I saw your tasting note, but the 20 was extraordinarily plush. So, I mean, Teyssier is, as you say, a great workhorse of a wine. It's fantastic value for money. And when the recent Suckling score, was it 94 for the 2018? We bought some extra for the club, and certainly Teyssier is a great one to stick a dozen of in the cellar while you're waiting for everything else to mature, basically, because it typically will drink in 3 to 5 years post vintage quite happily.
Yeah. The I must admit, I always take Teyssier myself in double magnums. I think it's a fantastic sort of Sunday lunch, big red to enjoy. You know, it's not frighteningly expensive by any stretch of imagination, and it just looks the part, and you can really have a lot of fun with those.
They actually bottle the double mags in those old-fashioned dumpy bottles.
Yeah, they're great. The little kind of squatties, they're very good fun. Just as we were talking about vintage comparison, and Nathan mentioned it, I thought another good comment that I pulled out from Colin Hayes' Bordeaux report, which I thought would be useful when referring to the character of the 2020 vintage. Generally, this is generally saying the 2020 has the freshness of 2016, the bright crunchiness and lift of 2017, the sheer substance, density, and concentration of 2018, and the elegance of 19. But this gets nowhere close to capturing the essence of these wines, and it would be to do a considerable injustice to them to reduce them to a list of previously recognized elements of former vintages. Well,
which he just did.
Yeah, exactly. It may be an injustice, but I'll tell you what, you know, if all the wines taste like that, and an awful lot that I've tried to do, then I think I'd be happy to be I'd be happy to be kind of, you know, deconstructed down in that manner. Well, what we'll do now, we're staying in Saint Emilion, but we're going back a couple of years, and we are going to Chateau Prieuré. And again, drawing comparisons to the 2020 vintage with 2016, one of the initial things to point out where there is a very, very obvious comparison is in the growing season. So, you know, 18 was a pretty hot year throughout. It was a broiler, you know, it was warm, warm, warm. And that's why you get this incredible intensity and concentration and lushness and richness of the 18 vintage. 16, like 20, pretty different story, and very similar in two key regards. 16 was one of the wettest vintages on record. It was incredibly soggy right through even into June, even beyond where we are now, April, May, you know, even into June, it was really soggy. And I think a lot of the winemakers were pretty pessimistic about the quality. The flowering and bud break and subsequent fruit set started really pretty late. And as you may recall, you know, the old idea is that, you know, you harvest 100 days from the bud break, basically, from the flowering, sorry. So, you know, things weren't looking good in 16, but then you had this incredible, very, very long, very, very hot, very, very dry summer. You know, it really was, you know, the vines were starting to suffer a little bit from heat stress towards the end of the season, but luckily there was a decent dump of rain just before the Merlot harvest, which just refreshed everything, and then another one just before the Cabernet harvest. Which is why, if you had to pick one vintage, probably of the last 20 years, you know, and there have been a lot of great vintages, you know, 5, 9, 10, 15, 16, 18, 19, 20. If you had to pick one that is really showing its quality, then, you know, 16 is a vintage which everyone keeps coming back to, both right bank and left bank, and saying is absolutely, you know, it's the one. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at the weather comparison, 2020 has been exceptionally similar. You know, an incredibly damp and soggy start to the year. I mean, really was very, very damp. Again, you know, so much rainfall did actually cause a degree of mildew, which it wasn't as cool as 16, but it was as damp. Cause for mildew, which is why sadly the volumes in 2020 are diminished by 10 to 20 to sometimes up to 30% or more. But then what we've also had is this incredibly dry, hot summer. So it's this notion of getting balance being an equilibrium of extremes. And I think in that regard, the weather patterns in 16 and 20 are very, very similar, which is why 2020 seems to be attracting the attention and the excitement that it is. Because whilst it's a hot vintage like 16, there's a freshness to the 20, and certainly what I've tasted, I know what Nathan and Charlie have tasted, there's a wonderful energy and vigor to the wines, which does remind you very much of 2016. Chateau Le Prieuré dates back to 1696, had a big renovation in 1998 when they did, they pretty much ripped up half of the vines, and they started planting a little bit more Cabernet Franc. So the total vineyard plantings now are about 75% Merlot and 25% Cabernet Franc, which is pretty much the blend of the wine. Along the way, the various owners, etc., the kind of the key people to bear in mind are the estate was part sold, then fully sold to Francois Pinault, a name I'm sure you'll all know, whose Artemis Domains then sold the estate quite recently to the Sur-Avenir Insurance Group, who own Calon Ségur. So, this is building an interesting insurer-owned block against probably the most famous, which is Christian Seeley's, well, not his, but he's the winemaker and technical director for the AXA Millésime group of Pichon Baron, Sudereau, who we launched today, by the way. Amazing Sauterne. Get your cases now. First growth Bordeaux for 40 quid. Yes, please. And until quite recently, Petit Village, somewhat underperforming Pomerol, which they sold last year. Anyway, this is a rather lovely estate, which is pretty small. This is 6.25 hectares, so a fraction of the size of Teyssier. And importantly, we're right up on the plateau. So the sort of the higher slopes of Saint Emilion, and in fact at 89 meters up, its highest vineyards are amongst the most elevated in Saint Emilion. Its neighbors is very close to Troblong-Mondo, who's doing amazing things right now. Also Trottevier and Pavie-Macquin. So it's in good territory. It's in good situation. And I think they're making some really pretty impressive wines. 50% new oak used here, so more oak than on the Teyssier. It's the 2016, which you're enjoying now, is the best vintage across the various critics' scores, or at least joint best, equal with 2018 and now 2020, which has actually received its highest score ever, 93 to 95 points from the Wine Advocate. So, clearly Prieuré is definitely one to watch. So what do you feel trying this one? Alongside Teyssier, do you see the sort of step up? What do you think about the vintage? Chris, you look set to say something. Go.
Well, I think the tannins are much more pronounced, and they're actually quite sharp, I think. Has this got some time to go yet, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 18 and the Teyssier particularly is probably still living on its primary fruit, whereas the 16 is definitely beginning to close down. 16 is a vintage which has an awful lot of structure. I think when you talk about the 16 vintage, yes, there is freshness and elegance there, but it is a wine which has some pretty classical, like 2010 and 2005, it definitely has a bigger tannic structure than 15 or 18 either side of it, or 2009, for example. So yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the drinking windows for this wine generally, you are strongly encouraged to put it away for at least 2 to 3 years. It's going to be a pretty big wine for sure, and one which yeah, is at that stage where the structure is beginning to grip the fruit. So yeah, interesting to try now, but definitely it's in that kind of awkward adolescent phase, I'd say.
Yeah.
Good. Any more comments or questions? I'm just checking on the chat if I'm missing stuff here. Nah, good. Nothing so far. Okay, fine. So let's by comparison, sticking with the 2016 vintage and everything I've said on that front, let's cross over to Pomerol and Gombaude Guillot. And I'm very intrigued to see what you think of Pomerol versus Saint Emilion in this regard. I suppose now is as good a time as any just to talk a little bit more about the, if not the hierarchy, but the classification system on the right bank of Bordeaux, because it's a bit more esoteric than we are used to on the left bank. For those of you who were joining us for our Northern Medoc session the other week, the 1855 classification is pretty easy to follow. Whether you agree with it or not is another matter, but you have first growth, Premier Cru down to fifth growth, then Cru Bourgeois. And on the right bank, however, oh, and by the way, just to remind you, it's unchanged, with the one key exception of Mouton Rothschild going up in 1973 from second growth to first growth. Apart from that, the 1855 classification has remained unchanged since 1855. On the right bank, however, in Saint Emilion, and this will become very pertinent when we come on to Le Dôme in a bit, but the key thing with Saint Emilion is that they reclassify every 10 years. The last reclassification was in 2012, and the next one will be next year. And this is great because it allows for progress, and it rewards those estates, those chateaus, those vineyards which have overperformed, and it allows them to benefit from the investment and resource they put into improving their wines. And therefore you do see wines going up on occasion, although it's rare. You do also see wines being demoted. Saint Emilion's classification system is a bit more simple than the left bank, or it's shorter anyway. You basically have Premier Grand Cru Classé A, which right now is 4 estates, Cheval Blanc and Auzone being the long-standing holders of that title, and they were joined in 2012 by Angelus and Pavie. And then after that, you have Premier Grand Cru Classé B, and there's a number of great chateaus in there, quite a few who are vying this year for elevation to A, basically, including Figeac and Canon, probably the two kind of hot to trot contenders. And then you have Premier Cru, Grand Cru, I beg your pardon, Grand Cru Classé, and then under that you have Grand Cru. So we'll talk more about this when we come onto the Dôme, because it'll become quite pertinent. But the key thing is, in Saint Emilion, you get a chance to rise. Just because someone said you were great in 1855 doesn't mean that you have to stay that way. And if someone didn't recognize you weren't even around in 1855, doesn't mean that you can't improve. Particularly pertinent for someone like Jonathan Maltus, who was a newcomer to Bordeaux, and in 1994 was one of the sort of the new wave of winemakers. Pomerol has no classification system at all. You're just Pomerol. You are just Pomerol. But that having been said, there is a tacit understanding of where the best terroirs are, and they tend to be the ones that are high up on the plateau. The building behind me is the wine that we will finish on this evening, Levangel, which is, one of the most elevated, in every sense of the word, expositions in Pomerol itself. Gombaude Guillot, probably a name I imagine not all of you will have encountered, or maybe even any of you, frankly. But it's a really rather exciting chateau. And I think I don't normally do this in these sessions, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to share my screen. I'm going to try and do this, or if actually maybe what I'll do, I've got a better idea. I'm going to put the link. I'm going to put the link into the chat here, so you can see where the vineyards are around the chateau. It's a small chateau, originally built in 1868, and was sort of slightly rebuilt a bit more in 1922. But even then, it was a cafe and a wine bar. It was where people used to hang out and have a glass of wine. And that's the thing with Pomerol. It's far more Burgundian in size and style than on the left bank. You don't get big chateaus in Pomerol. Famously, Le Pin, the most expensive of all Bordeaux, more so even than Petrus. It was always a bit of a disappointment for people visiting, because you sort of were looking out for some massive castle or some impressive edifice to announce your arrival, at Le Pin. And in fact, it was a shack. It was like a 2-up, 2-down shack with the washing hanging outside, and you drive past it at least half a dozen times before realizing that, there it was. They have now built a lovely, modest bijou chateau, and the washing isn't outside anymore. But, anyway, the point is, Pomerol is not flashy. There aren't big castles or manicured lawns. It's very, very villagey. And yet it makes some of the most sublime wines in the whole of Bordeaux. If you've clicked on the link I sent, or if not, I'll send it. You can do so later. But the point is that the neighbors here are Trotanois to the southwest and l'Église Clinée to the northeast. So these are two names who are giants in Pomerol, and it's right bang in the middle. So you may not have heard of it, but it's got some pretty impressive terroir. It's only 6.9 hectares, planted 65% Merlot, 30% Cabernet Franc, and also 5% Malbec, although that doesn't currently seem to make it into the blend of the Grand Vin at the moment. But who knows, as climate change continues, a bit more Malbec, I think, could well find it there. And another quite important fact is that their consultant is Thomas Duclos. So Thomas is, he is the man right now. On the right bank of Bordeaux, he is the man behind the Renaissance of Troppel-en-Mondo. He is the consultant has consulted at Canon, we mentioned earlier. He is also the consultant for the last couple of years at Le Dome as well with Jonathan. So he crops up everywhere, and he seems to have the Midas touch when it comes to Merlot and Cabernet Franc on the right bank. He seems to be doing incredible things, and it's super encouraging, the quality of the wines that are being produced now. The estate has been organic since 2000, so one of the early pioneers of sustainable viticulture on the right bank, and they've been fully biodynamic since 2005. 50% new oak is used on the wines, although they've now started experimenting with kind of foudre, large foudre from Austrian oak, and even some amphora as well. So they're really, it's a small estate, as I said, only 6.9 hectares. one that a lot of you won't have heard of. And yeah, I think they're one to watch. They're in a great position. They've got a great winemaker, a great consultant. They're 100% biodynamic. They're constantly seeking to improve the wines. They're good. And again, we're still in the 2016 vintage, so it's a phenomenal wine. What do you feel about this compared to the Prieuré? Is it drinking better now? What do you think?
A lot smoother, I think.
Mm-hmm.
A lot smoother, and just feels more fruity in the mouth.
Yeah, I mean,
sort of grows in the mouth.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because it is, it's more or less the same blend. It's the same 50% new oak, and yet, you know, there's a plushness and a softness and a suppleness there, you know, and I think in some respects that can often be the fundamental difference between Pomerol and Saint Emilion. Saint Emilion can be more structured, more of this kind of clay over limestone soil, whereas up here on the plateau in Pomerol, a little bit more sand, a little bit of blue clay as well, which we'll come on to. We'll talk a bit when we move on. But yeah, you know, there's a beautiful. You can understand why Pomerol is often considered the Burgundy lovers' Bordeaux. In fact, you know, it's just a bit softer, more perfumed, more sort of supple. But yeah,
it's much plusher, much plummier, finer tannins, and darker fruit characteristic. And by comparison, it makes the Le Prieuré of the same age and same composition, as you said, feel as though it's gone into a bit of a dumb phase.
Yeah.
Whereas this Pomerol is still quite primary.
No.
Drinking now, this is the nicest one so far this evening.
Yeah.
The drinking now. What's the price point on it?
That's a tremendously good question. I'll rely on Charlie or Nathan just to pull that up.
I'll just go look it up.
Yeah, it's quite modest. Let's put it that way. And you know, Pomerol tends to be pretty pricey. I'd have to say a quick plug for another Pomerol, which has been hugely successful. We launched Domaine de l'Église, which again on that same map I posted in chat, you can see is very close by. That is an absolutely staggeringly good value Pomerol. That's like 166 quid for 6 in Bond, 96 to 97 points from James Suckling. I mean, it's absolutely, you know, we know James is a generous scorer, but even so, that is a huge score and a tiny price for you know, an estate which is in fact right next door to the one that we're about to move on to, the Vray Croix de Gay. So actually that's, yeah, okay. So £70 duty paid. Thanks, Nathan. Could also put a link to the Domaine de l'Église in there as well for good measure, as I managed to crowbar it into this session.
Is that for the 2016, Charlie, or is that for the 2020 en primeur?
No, the one what I've put in was just a very rough price for the 2016.
Okay.
We don't have any ourselves, but I just did a quick look. But the Domaine de l'Église that Tom's just mentioned, we bought a little bit extra of because it was just so good. I'll stick a link to that. The general link for our 2020s I put just above, but I'll put a specific link for l'Église.
Thanks, Nathan.
So we're staying in Pomerol, but we are dropping down a vintage to 2015, and I'm really very interested to see what you think of this one. This estate, I shouldn't really call it estate. It's far too small to be an estate. It's not even 4 hectares. But it was founded in the end of the 19th century, and you know, it went through. It had a number of different names, a number of different owners, etc. I think the key thing is here, if the position of the Gombaude Guillot is impressive in terms of where the vineyards are. If you have a look at where Vray Croix de Gay is, I mean, it's insane. It is insane. It is slap bang between Petrus and Le Fleur. You know, it's right in the middle. There's no mucking around here. It's not all quite close to, or you know, you can see across. You know, it's literally right in between the two, which must mean that you know the value of the land here and what they could charge for their wines is pretty phenomenal. So amazing situation to begin with. This was owned by the Goldschmidt family since 2005, again after various owners, and this too was also sold, but only in September, to Suravenir, the insurers we mentioned previously. So they've obviously been on a bit of a buying spree. And this is 80% Merlot, 20% Cabernet Franc. You know, we're seeing a trend here on the right bank, or are we? Well, wait and see. And here the soils are a combination of gravel over clay with some iron as well, some iron in the soil too. 2016, the year after this, was their first fully organic and biodynamic vintage. But obviously they were well on the way to conversion when this was made, the 2015. And it's 50% new oak. So to be honest, an awful lot of similarity with the previous two. However, we're in the 2015 vintage. Now, 2015, by comparison to 16, by comparison to 20 or even 19, is probably a year which has more similarity to 2018. You know, it was another very, very warm and continually warm vintage. There's a sense of great warmth and generosity to the 15 vintage. It's very opulent, it's very round. You know, 15 will certainly drink ahead of 16, generally speaking, on both banks of the river. It was also a year where you know, it was a phenomenal year for the southern Medoc. So for those of you who are joining us next week, we'll talk about 2015. You know, it's a great year for the southern Medoc, and i.e. Margaux and Pessac-Léognan in particular, and it was an exceptionally good year on the right bank as well. It was actually a bit more challenging for the traditional kind of heartlands of the Gironde. So, you know, Pauillac, even Saint Julien did better, but Pauillac and particularly Saint Estèphe, you know, you have to be a bit cautious with 15. You know, yes, it's a 5-star vintage, but it is not homogeneous in the northern Medoc. But southern Medoc and over in Saint Emilion Pomerol made some stunning wines. And generally speaking, you know, the scores for 15s and 18s on the right bank tend to exceed those on the left bank. So we do sort of thinking of it as being a bit of a right bank vintage, which is once again why we thought it'd be an interesting wine to show in light of the 2020. And the other reason that it's particularly fun to talk about the wine this evening is that, and again, this is a complete coincidence, we know, we have it on the grapevine, well, we know that the 2020 is going to be released tomorrow. So the 2020 Vray Croix de Gay is coming out tomorrow. So we're really eagerly anticipating that. It's got some terrific scores. It will be a good price. I can't tell you what the price will be because we don't quite know, but you know, pretty sure it'll be interesting. We could probably do a quick benchmark, Nathan, or a bound.
I mean, I'm hoping it'll be, you know, somewhere around £270 for 6, sort of £45 in bond a bottle. I mean, I think, Tom, we ought to let everybody know that, you know, prices are anywhere between about roughly level. There's very little that's less than last year, to about 14% up. But most of the ones we've gone for have been around 4 or 5 or 7% up from last year. And the main characteristic for us as a wine club is actually production is overall about 20% down. So even though Honest Grapes has been growing as a club, it's actually quite hard to get double the wine this year. So we've struggled a bit, but we are hoping to have this one tomorrow morning. So we haven't told anybody else that. There's one more to come in that light. So
indeed there is. In fact, we're moving on to it right now.
That's not a sales pitch, by the way, for Jump On It when it comes out, but literally it's amazing. I never realized, moving from being a wine collector to having having this wine club with Tom, how difficult it can be to get 60 bottles of something you really like. I just thought they fell off the printing press. They really don't, not in these areas.
Well, especially when you've got a barely 3.5 hectare vineyard like these guys. So no, watch this space tomorrow. If you like this, I think the 2020 is going to be their best ever, frankly.
And actually, as the one we're coming to applies to the first one as well, Tom.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we're now going to conclude with a pair from 2012. We're heading back to Saint Emilion, and can make no apologies for heading back to Jonathan Maltus, a dear friend that he is, but also being able to get access to these mature vintages is not easy. So it's thanks to him we were able to source some cases of the 2012 directly. I think these only landed earlier this month, basically.
Yeah, 12 weeks ago, Tom.
Yeah. And first of all, let's just talk about the vintage, I think, because they're both 2012, so we can dispense with that. 2012, unlike 15, unlike 16, unlike 18, which are 5-star vintages, 2012 was not considered a 5-star vintage. It was considered pretty challenging. It was pretty cool and damp again. Then luckily it sort of dried up and warmed up later on. So again, some similarity to the 18 and 20 that we've discussed, but you didn't necessarily get the same heat and ripeness as you did in those vintages. And also, to be perfectly honest, the winemaking then was not as advanced best part of a decade ago as it is now. However, what's absolutely true with 2012, especially on the right bank, is how it's being massively reappraised. And, it's now being very much considered, if not a 5-star vintage, but definitely a 4-star vintage for the top producers on the right bank. And it has been called, a winemaker's vintage. It didn't hand it to you on a plate. But if you are like Jonathan, making an incredibly small quantity, 2,500 cases, it's virtually nothing. Then you were really able to hone the quality, to be very selective and make something pretty impressive. Now, some of you will have heard me or even Jonathan talking about Le Dôme. So but for those of you who haven't, I want to give you the full brief. Le Dôme, Jonathan bought and made the first vintage in 1996, so 2 years after having installed himself at Teyssier. And the situation of Le Dôme is it's just in front, we're on the côte of Saint Emilion, so the better vineyards. It's just in front of Angelus. You've got Canon and Berliquet as its neighbors, and also Beausejour-Becot just above. So a brilliant situation, some pretty stellar neighbors. Now, Jonathan bought this vineyard, and it was only I think it was a month or so in when his then consultant sort of gave him the bad news, which was that he'd bought a vineyard with wonderfully old vines, which was great, planted in the 60s, but it wasn't 70% Merlot and 20% Cabernet Franc, as he thought. It was the other way around. It was 80% Cabernet Franc and 20% Merlot, which is, well, at the time, and even today, was very, very unusual. And to this day, Le Dôme remains the highest expression of Cabernet Franc in the whole of Bordeaux. If you consider another chateau, which prides itself on the high percentage of its Cabernet Franc, it's Cheval Blanc. So Cheval Blanc has up to 65% Cabernet Franc in the blend. And you know, Cheval Blanc is Cheval Blanc. It's the greatest Saint Emilion. So it's quite interesting, especially now with climate change, showing how the later ripening varieties that are more heat resistant, like Cabernet Franc, do particularly well. That Jonathan seems to be in a very, very good place with Le Dôme. 3.5 hectares. So we're now even smaller than Vray Croix de Gay. And this is a properly boutique production. The new winery by Lord Norman Foster is being completed as we speak. It will be ready in time for the harvest this year, where the production of Le Dôme will move into. And this is very, very important because we talked about the reclassification of Bordeaux that's happening next year. And what has prevented Le Dôme being put forward for elevation previously was largely due to the fact that in order to be reclassified, the wine needs to be made in its own winery. And obviously Le Dôme, 2,500 cases, nothing at all, was being made down the road at Teyssier, where you've got 15,000 cases. So with the completion of this new winery, yes, it's been designed by Lord Norman Foster, which is tremendous news, and it looks incredible. But the key thing is, it is its own winery, which now is the final link in the chain to allow it to go forward for reclassification next year, where there is every expectation, given the quality of the wine, that it will be bumped up. And just to put that again in context, Le Dôme has received 100 points from Robert Parker. It received 98 to 99 points in the last few vintages. And the 2020 vintage, as of, I think was it Monday, or it might have been Friday last week, was received basically the second best score given to any wines in 2020 from the Wine Advocate. So another 98 to 99 point wine. So, it's absolutely, one of the best in Saint Emilion. And it's it would be very, very unfair if it were not elevated in the reclassification next year. The reason this is important, of course, is because if you look at the trajectory of wines that have been reclassified, like Angelus, like Pavé, the price shoots up. If you look at a better comparison, which is Stefan von Nieperg's La Mondotte, when it was reclassified from Grand Cru up to Grand Cru Classé Première B, went up by 136% in 8 years. So, that's, not saying that Le Dôme is going to do that, because it's already quite an expensive wine, but nevertheless, there is every expectation the wine is going to go up in price. So we love having access to these older vintages to be able to try them whilst they're just about the right side of affordable.
Tom, quick question, just a technical question. If he does get re-rated next year, what does it do to the prices of the vintages prior to that year?
They all go up.
It sends them, they go as well, do they?
Absolutely, of course, because all of a sudden, it drags everything up. And that's why there is, frankly, a bit of a scramble for back vintages of all the wines that are likely to be reclassified next year. We are, in fact, going to be doing an offer tomorrow on Canon and possibly Figeac, and we have been doing quite a big offer on Le Dôme generally. So nothing is guaranteed, but it would be dare I say it, a travesty if Le Dôme was not very, very seriously considered for elevation next year. And we also found out this afternoon, it really was just this afternoon, that Le Dôme is going to be released tomorrow, the 2020. Unfortunately, they did suffer from mildew, so the volume is down quite considerably, 25%, which is normally Jonathan's way of saying I'm going to hike the price up, but we don't know. We just don't know. But it's the greatest vintage he's made since the 100-point rated 2010. And we are very excited. We just hope that the price, as Nathan said, remains within, within sort of 14-15% of the 19, and it will be very good indeed.
It's a big day for Saint Emilion Pomerol tomorrow.
Yeah.
Vray Croix de Gay, Le Dôme, Teyssier, Vieux Chateau Mazarin.
Yeah.
Bonte Labrie 2020.
Yeah.
94, 96 points from Jeb Dunnock.
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be big. It's going to be big.
There's pure coincidence that we're tasting all these this evening.
Yeah. Yeah.
I read today, Tom, that Tom Dunnock had said that he said Pomerol was the standout appellation for 2020.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think what I would say, Chris, is read the link that I'll send you by Colin Hay, because it's not that he, or from that matter me, disagree. It's just a bit more nuanced than that. Unquestionably, the best wines in Saint Emilion and Pomerol are amongst the best wines that have ever been made from these appellations, but it just isn't homogeneous. There are some unexciting wines from Pomerol and Saint Emilion. So it's I think what Colin said was 2020 is a great amplifier of terroir, of quality terroir, as in, where you had the right soils, clay over limestone in the case of Saint Emilion Pomerol, you would have done well, basically. But it's unquestionably, there are some fabulous wines in Pomerol, no doubt whatsoever. And in fact, it seems appropriate to, talking about Pomerol, to conclude with one of the best. Sticking with 2012, here we are with Levangel, one of the oldest estates in Pomerol, dating back to 1741. In 1862, it was purchased by Jean-Paul Chaperon, who changed the name from Domaine de Fazilot, thankfully. And he built the chateau, which still stands there, in 1874. And he also bought a few extra acres of vineyard as well. And other than that, it's remained largely unchanged for the best part of 200 years. Position-wise, it is next to Conseillon in Pomerol, another great chateau, but probably more tellingly, the vineyards are right next to, as in they literally, you cross the track, they're next to Cheval Blanc. So, in some respects, if you say Cheval Blanc is the most Pomerol-like of Saint Emilions, you could say that Levangel is the most Saint Emilion-like of Pomerols. Hang on. Saint Emilion is the most Pomerol-like of... Okay, shall I just be quiet? Cheval Blanc is the most Pomerol-like of Saint Emilions. Levangel is the most Saint Emilion-like of Pomerols. There we go. Go on. I should stop drinking so early. But what's particularly fascinating about Levangel is the distribution of different soil types that really make for an incredibly fascinating wine. Yes, you have this clay and gravel with a bit of iron oxide, which forms the bulk of the vineyards. But the vineyards which are nearest to Petrus have a heavy percentage of the blue clay, for which Petrus is most famous, and which provides this incredible, supple, powerful, rich fruit. But it also has some of the gravelly, sandy soils that we most associate in the neighboring vineyards of Cheval Blanc. So you've got a little bit of everything, and this gives Levangel such an incredible cohesion, such a great sense of balance, and it's a very complete wine. In 1900, it was considered in the unofficial sort of hierarchy of Pomerol as being the third best wine of the appellation after Petrus and Vieux Chateau Certain, another great name from the appellation. In 1990, owner Simon Ducasse sold 70% of Levangel to Domaine de Rothschild. That's the branch of the Rothschilds which was owned or is owned by Eric de Rothschild. And then the Domaine de Rothschild bought the remaining shares in 1999. So it's been under the complete control of Domaine de Rothschild since 1999. there is quite a fun story that in that transition period, Madame Ducasse was, shall we say, not entirely aligned with the vision of the new majority owners, in that she vehemently disagreed with the concept of new oak, mostly because it cost money. Buying new barrels for her seemed like a waste of money. We've got perfectly good barrels. We've only used them a couple of years. Why would we need new oak? What do we need that for? So in order not to rock the boat, but to improve the quality of the wine, the Rothschild administration, in the dead of night, would secretly roll new barrels into the barrel cellar in the chateau, replace the old ones, not tell her, obviously not bill her anything. So, you know, she never found out and couldn't quite understand why the wine sort of dramatically improved over the next few years. So Levangel, even then, even after the Rothschilds took full control in the late 90s, was still, you know, it made great wines. In the old days, it made amazing wines. Just after the frosts of 56, it was still making some incredible vintages, but it's been kind of under the radar. And then 2018, Baron Eric's daughter, Saskia de Rothschild, became not only the president of Domaine de Rothschild, but obviously the president of Chateau Lafite at the age of 31, but also Levangel. And she has really made it her mission to put Levangel, you know, on the map, or into the sort of space it belongs, and, you know, totally succeeding. If you consider that last year, the 2019 was one of Decanter's only 100-point rated wines. It was on a 3, you know, and it is an incredible wine. And frankly, I think the 20 is absolutely on the same trajectory. You know, even Jane Anson writing for Decanter, it's only a point behind the 19. It's certified organic this year. So the 2021 vintage will be the first certified organic vintage. But again, just goes to show that all these top chateaus are becoming more and more sustainably aware of sustainability. They're still using 70% new oak, so still a hefty whack of new oak. And they're making between 2,000 and 3,000 cases. I think in the case of the 2020, which will be released as and when, I think it'll be more in the order of 2,500 cases. So again, a very, very small boutique production. 2012, I think it's drinking beautifully now. It's really showing all that kind of soft, supple Pomerol fruit, really attractive, spicy, a great florality. But in some respects, you know, 2012, it's a good vintage. It's, if you, I mean, you know, it's sort of 94, 95 points generally across the board. But you know, for me, Levangel got exciting last year. And, you know, last year was one of our best selling wines for sure. And I think 2020 will be the same. You know, this is a winery which is absolutely, you know, gunning for the top position. And, you know, when you consider, as I said, it was previously considered in the top 3 of Pomerol, I think it's definitely back there. It's definitely back there now. So, yeah.
I sampled a case myself of the 19, Tom.
Ah, good.
Of the Levangel. I'm expecting to do the 20.
Yeah. So what do you guys think about those last 2 wines? Maybe, you know, anyone prefer one specifically over the other, or not? Were there any?
Levangel for me.
Yeah. Why was that, David? What was the sort of
nice and plummy and jammy, and you know, I can just imagine what I would eat with it.
Yes. Yeah. Gorgeous wine, isn't it? No real edges. It's just, yeah.
Yep.
Glad you persuaded me to buy a couple of cases of the 2019, the Dom. Tom.
Yeah.
It really is beautiful.
Yeah, I think the thing with Le Dome, which is it is unique, is this very high percentage of Cabernet Franc, and it, as Jonathan always says, it gives the full stop to the wine. You know, Merlot, actually, to David's point, you know, Merlot is just gloriously kind of plummy and plump, and you know, very, very delicious and round and opulent and sexy. The Cabernet Franc gives the kind of the structure, it gives the boundaries, it gives the wine just a little more finesse, shall we say, you know, and I think that's equally attractive as well, you know, in a different way, but you know, but I hope you enjoyed the tasting this evening, particularly those last two, because you know, drinking if not fully mature, but certainly properly maturing right bank wines is a real joy, you know. And I think one thing I'd say about the 2020 vintage, again referring back to Colin's article in the drinks business, is yes, it's a great vintage for Merlot, unquestionably, but it's a great vintage for Merlot which has been forced to be more structural and structured. So, you know, in the past, Merlot gave the kind of the plush, plummy fruit to the Cabernet Sauvignons, otherwise quite strict, you know, blackcurrant and graphite character. But, you know, this is the year where if you got it right, Merlot was not only kind of sexy and hedonistic, but it was also structural. It also gave the backbone to the wine. So, you know, whether right bank or left bank, it's definitely a year to look out for great quality Merlot on the right soils, which were able to deal with the drought and the heat. Good. Right, team. Any more comments, questions? By the way, one thing I would say is Charlie has been hard at work on this kind of interactive polls and questions things. So we didn't quite have it in place this evening, but for those of you who are joining us for next week and future tastings, we're intending to make you work. You can't just sit back and enjoy the wines, listen to me rabbit on. We're going to ask questions, get your opinions, and you just click things, and all sorts of whizzy graphs and stuff come up. So you know, it's adding a new element to these tastings, basically, and giving me time to have a drink as well.
It's better invite Dominic Cummings then.
Oh, yeah. Come on, we don't have enough time in the tastings to invite Dominic Cummings, surely.
Yeah, he's probably got time on his hand now.
Just give me he's got time on his hand. No, I thought, like Chris, if I may, I thought Le Dome was just lovely, just a beautiful, you know, in every way, a kind of beautiful wine, a food wine, a simply sit and drink it wine, you know, on a special occasion or with, you know, a good group of people. Just genuinely lovely, and one I think, yeah, one to look out for.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think Jonathan would be delighted to hear that. Certainly, for me, it's a wine which is very dear to my heart. I know Nathan as well. You know, but it's a wine which takes on so much more nuances with about this sort of decade's worth of age. You know, it changes, frankly. It becomes truly, you know, and so different from other Bordeaux's because of that high percentage of Cabernet Franc. So yeah, super exciting.
It's been great to see the differences between Saint Emilion and Pomerol, tasting them next to each other this evening. It's been really interesting. Great. So I think being more of a Burgundian than a Bordelais myself, I've always found the lack of all the different classifications in Saint Emilion quite confusing. And although I know the 1855 thing is a load of old tosh, at least it gives you something to hang your hat on when you're looking at the left bank. Yeah. And actually that sort of, I mean, Pomerol is the most Burgundian area. And Chris, it was funny when you were asking earlier about, you know, buying them. The problem with Pomerol is it's quite Burgundian. It's small production. It's hard to find. It's usually relatively expensive.
Yeah. So, Tom, you mentioned Physiac possibly getting upgraded. What will it do for my 6 bottles of 2000 and 2001?
It'll do good things, Chris.
Should I be drinking it yet?
It'll mean you'll have an even bigger smile on your face when you drink them. Yeah. No, Yeah, you'll feel guilty about pulling them out on a Tuesday. Put it that way.
I cross my fingers.